Do y'all like the shorter days? And the sun goes down about 5:30 and gets dark right then. I remember as a kid, I hated the days that you had to stay in the field till 9:30, 10 o'clock. I didn't like that. And so I always liked when the days got shorter. However, when it was this short, sometimes that was not the best. And I know, Daddy, he always, this time of year, he wanted to get out of school as quickly as he could and get to the field, usually to strip cotton, because he wanted to get some work done after school. And of course the sun would go down quickly, and we would keep working long after sundown. And some days we got a lot done. We did. But there were days where something would happen at school, and he wouldn't get out of school quite as quickly as he wanted to. And then of course this time of year I would probably have basketball practice, so I wouldn't get out there as quickly as he wanted me to. And then sometimes something would happen. A rock would get stuck in the auger of the stripper. And it gets dark and you got a rock, it's hard to find it. It just takes time. And then maybe a cow would get out. Or maybe some kid's show pig would need to be doctored. And it just seemed like when something would happen, it would be one thing right after another. And I could just hear Daddy saying, if it's not one thing, it's 50. And Blackie and Jimmy, Monty, Paul, y'all probably all have heard him say that. If it's not one thing, it's 50. And he would get really frustrated. Jesus sometimes had days kind of like that, where it was just one thing after another happened. Now, I don't know that he got as frustrated as Daddy did. I think Jesus was probably more calm, was more able to handle frustrations. But sometimes when you look at it, it seems like a lot of things happened. When you look at the 14th chapter of Matthew, you see that a lot of things happened to Jesus. First of all, Jesus learns that his cousin, John the Baptist, the man that baptized him, one of his mentors, had been executed by Herod. And when he learns of that, he says to his disciples, let us go off to a desolate place. And in Matthew it just says into a desolate place. I think in Mark it may be, let us go off to a desolate place to pray. But he wants to go off by himself, and he does, with his disciples. But the thing about it is, when he goes off by himself, that's not what happens. The people find him. And the people have demands on him. They are sick and they want him to heal him. They want him to heal them. They have lots of problems that they want Jesus to deal with. And then after he has done that, Jesus does that. Even though he wants to be alone, he wants to grieve about his cousin. When the people show up with problems, he deals with them. But at the end of the day, the disciples come to him and say, we can't feed all these people. You need to send them home. Now, we all know what happened. We know that story. Jesus says, you give them something to eat. And they say, how are we going to do that? And they find 2 fish and 5 loaves. And Jesus prays over it. And he feeds 5,000 men, not counting women and children. That he distributes that with the disciples. And so, first of all, he has the news of the death of a friend, of a loved one. Then he has demands put upon him by the crowd. And then his disciples aren't able to do what he thinks they might should. When he asks them to do something, they can't do it. But he gets it all done. And then at the end, it starts in verse 22 of chapter 14. We're going to start reading right there. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it is a ghost. And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. So Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Now, have y'all ever been on the, I know you have, if you've been to Amarillo, and when you go through Washburn, there's a billboard there on the side. It's advertising Kenneth White Art Gallery. And what it is a reproduction of one of Kenneth White's paintings. He's the guy that paints lots of biblical scenes. And what it is a reproduction of Jesus on the water. And he's standing on the water, and there are waves around. But as he stands there, he doesn't look afraid, certainly. But he also doesn't look terrifying. And when we read this chapter, when we read this passage, the disciples are terrified of Jesus walking on the water. This isn't the first time that Jesus and the apostles have been on the water. Back in chapter 8, they're crossing the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus is asleep in the boat. And that time, the disciples are afraid that they're going to be swamped by the winds and the wave. And they say to Jesus, they wake him up in chapter 8, verse 25, they say, "Save us, Lord, we're perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" Here in chapter 8, the disciples are afraid of the wind and the waves. And when Jesus calms it, they say, "What sort of man is this?" But in chapter 14, that's not what we have. When they see Jesus striding across the waves of chaos and on top of the water, they are terrified of him. This is not an unusual occurrence for when humanity meets up with God. If you'll remember back in when the children of Israel are wandering in the desert and they come to the Mount of Sinai, and they look up and God is on the mountain and there's lightning and storms, and they say to Moses, "We don't want to go up there. We are afraid. You go up there and talk to God. We don't want to go." Because when God showed up, they were afraid. In Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah is in the throne room of God and he sees God on his throne, Isaiah is terrified when he comes into the presence of God. And here, when they see Jesus walking across the waves, they know that this is not normal. They know that there is something here, and they are terrified. I think that one of the things that they learn is this is God, and we are not, and we are terrified. When we look at this story, one of the things that we see is it says that Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. Some translations have it that Jesus compelled them to get into the boat and leave. And Jesus wanted some time alone to pray. And I think there's a lesson there. Because when they're out there in this storm, as we are in storms sometimes, we are. Look at our life today. We know that. We have the pandemic. We have storms. We have all kinds of things. Violence all over the country. Our country is in turmoil. And there are storms in our personal lives. They're there. People are sick. And we don't know what to do. And we can kind of be like those disciples. We don't always know what to do. But then there is Peter, who says, "Lord, if it is you, bid me come out." And I got to tell you, when I think about that, I think, if it is you, Lord? If I wasn't confident it was Jesus, I don't think I'd be wanting to get out of the boat at all. But he says, "If it's you, Lord, bid me come." I think I would probably more likely say, "Jesus, let's go down to the local swimming pool, down there on the wading pool type, and let's try to walk across the water there. And if I fail, I'm going to sink a couple of feet. Not out on the Sea of Galilee in the middle of a storm." But Peter does. Peter is a very impetuous disciple who sometimes acts without thinking. We see that for good in this instance. We also see that when it's not so good, that he sometimes says things without thinking, does things without thinking. But here he shows faith when he gets out of that boat. It's easy to say, hey, he lost his faith and he began to sink. Yeah, he did. But he got out of the boat in the middle of storms. And he put his eyes on Jesus. And he began to walk towards Jesus. And when we think of that, as long as his eyes are on Jesus, he does pretty good. And I think that's one of the lessons we can take from this story. Is that when we keep our eyes on Jesus, when we keep our focus on Jesus, we do pretty good. Jesus takes care of us. But when we take our eyes off Jesus, that's when we get in trouble, and that's when we get to sink. The wind and the waves distracted him. And we have lots of distractions in our lives. Our work, the TV, the politics, the world around us, the daily news, all of those tend to distract us. They tend to take our eyes off Jesus. And when that happens, we begin to sink, just like Peter did. But one thing Peter knew to do is he knew to turn to Jesus and say, Lord, save me. When we look at the disciples in these stories, we see that when they're originally on the boat and Jesus is asleep and they're in the middle of the storm, they don't do very well without Jesus. When they try to feed the 5,000 without Jesus, they don't know what to do. When they're on the boat without Jesus and they take their eyes off Jesus, they don't do very well. Every time they don't put Jesus in the center and put their faith in Jesus, they don't do very well. And again, I think we can take a lesson from that. That when we don't put our focus on Jesus, when we don't have Jesus as the center of our lives, we don't do very well. But one of the things we do see, in the first time when they're in that boat, what do they say? Who is this man who even the winds and the waves obey? But here, when they see Jesus striding across the waves and he calms the storm, it says, truly you are the Son of God. And that's the question that we're faced with. All of us are. Who is this man? And do we have that answer? Truly you are the Son of God. Can we say that to Jesus when we see him, when we talk to him, when we go to him in prayer? Can we say, truly you are the Son of God? Can we have our focus on him? One of the things that we need to remember is when Peter began to sink, Jesus reached out his hand to save him. And it is the exact same hand reaching out to us today. That when we are overwhelmed with our busyness, when we're over, not just busyness, but with real problems, and we just don't know what to do. You know, sometimes it seems like it's just almost overwhelming. Back in Deuteronomy, when Moses is talking to the people, this is in Deuteronomy 28. He's talking to the people, and Moses says to them, this is in 28:66. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. Night and day you shall be in dread and have no assurance of your life. In the morning you shall say, if only it were evening. And at evening you shall say, if only it were morning. Because of the dread that your heart shall feel, and the sights that your eyes shall see. I know that we've all been in that situation. That we can't go to sleep because we're worrying about something. And we just say, man, if I can just make it through the morning. And then we get up in the morning and we look at all that's going on. We look at all we have to do and all the problems that are hitting us. And we say, if I can just make it to evening. And that's what Moses was talking to them. But one of the things he said, because of the dread that your heart shall feel and the sights that your eyes shall see. It's that dread of our heart and the sights that we shall see that takes our focus off Jesus. Just like Peter. It was what he saw. When he saw the winds and the waves is when he began to sink. And so we want to keep that focus on Jesus. And let's answer that question. Who is this? Who is this that calms the sea? And who is this that sticks out his hand for us? Because the exact same hand that came out to rescue Peter in the Sea of Galilee is the exact same hand that is reaching out to us today. It is Jesus' hand. It was Jesus' hand then, and it is Jesus' hand today. The invitation is the same. Just reach out and take his hand.